Well, a very good afternoon to everyone here on behalf of UK and a Changing Europe, the Resolution Foundation and About Onward. This is our first joint session together looking at what happens now, Britain under a new leadership. Now, before I say any more by way of introduction, I am, of course, extremely mindful, as I'm sure are all of you, of the current situation regarding the Queen's health. And I think I would like to acknowledge on behalf of us all our thoughts for the Queen and for the royal family through what is clearly a very difficult time, both personally and, of course, constitutionally. With your permission, we are going to go ahead with the event this afternoon, but if we hear news, I think we will bring this event to a quiet close, and I hope you'll think that's the appropriate way forward, and you're happy with that as a way of managing the situation. So my name's Catherine Barnard. I'm Deputy Director of UK and a Changing Europe, and I am a lawyer, so really sit very uncomfortably between these very distinguished economists. But because I'm not an economist, if I don't understand what they're saying, I will try and interrupt them, because clearly there may be others who don't follow. This UK and a Changing Europe, for those of you who've kind enough to have followed us for a number of years, since 2016 when we were formally set up, has gone through various iterations. But one of the things that I would like to say is that ESRC have funded us for another 3 years. And although our initial brief was looking at Brexit and the implications of Brexit, we are, of course, carrying on with that work, but also looking somewhat wider, particularly looking at the position of the UK in respect of its new relationship with the EU, but also in respect of its position in the wider world. Now, one of the things that we are trying to do as UK and Changing Europe is to reach out to those parts that perhaps other organisations don't reach, and in particular to try and make social sciences, academic work accessible to a much wider audience. The other thing that we do, and which I think makes us distinctive, is that we are impartial. We do not try and advocate for particular policy perspectives. And therefore, I hope you find the information that we put out there useful to you in your own work. And one of the things that we would like to do more of in our slightly reformed existence is to work with other organisations like the Resolution Foundation and About Onward, with whom we have co-hosted this event today. If you'd like to know more about what we're doing, Anand Menon, who is the very well-known director of UK and a Changing Europe, has written some blogs which are widely available. He sends deep apologies that he is not here. He's had to go to Brussels to talk to the European Parliament, so I'm afraid you have got me instead. I want to stop there by way of introductory remarks and say something about our very fine panel of speakers. David Willetts, of course, extremely well known to everyone here. Lord Willetts, he wears a number of hats, but most importantly for our purposes, of course, has been Minister for Universities and Science, having worked in the Treasury and in Number 10. He now has chaired recently the Foundation, the Resolution Foundation's Intergenerational Commission, and he will talk for about 10 minutes on his thoughts about what happens now. And then Julian Jessup on my left and Jonathan Portes on my right will respond for about 6 minutes or so. Julian Jessup is very much a man of the moment, certainly a man in much demand, and he's just told me that his wife's very keen to get him out of the house because the phone doesn't stop ringing. Just proves just what a man he is, how much demand there is for his services. professional economist, 35 years experience in all sorts of fora, both public and private sector. And Jonathan Portes is my favourite economist. We work very closely together for a very long period of time, and he explains economics in terms that even lawyers can understand. On that note, I would like to stop and welcome David to the floor. Thank you very much indeed, David.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and it's great to be with you this afternoon, even though it may be a rather sombre day. Let us hope not. But it's good that the three different think tanks and organisations are working together, and we really appreciate the opportunity of doing this collaboration. Many of my colleagues at Resolution, the really clever ones, are still doing their analysis of this morning's announcement. We've got some of it that I've been able to incorporate into my presentation. I can tell you that for example, that we have the very important statement in the current draft of our press release that the Foundation notes that while it's currently uncosted, we estimate that support for households over the next 6 months is likely to cost around XX billion pounds. So I'm a bit like the old days of being a minister, just a touch underbriefed when you turn up, and worse than that, it could rise to Y billion pounds over 2 years. However, we are already saying we think it could well be more expensive than the 137 billion pounds, which was the cost of the bailout of the banks after the financial crisis. So a very significant announcement. And we have actually got some analysis that I can share with you. What I'm going to try to do very briefly is look both at the very short term, the package, the energy price issue, the medium term, over the lifetime of this Parliament, out to 2024, and then the underlying challenge, which I think we can all see, of just raising the performance of the British economy, which we have called in our current economic inquiry a stagnation nation, because, and it's one of the themes of our inquiry, we observe that part of Britain's problem is just not enough mobility and not enough economic change and not enough change in sectors and not enough labour mobility. Well, first of all, inflation. And we do estimate that today's announcement will have reduced inflation by about 4% compared with what it otherwise would have been. And also because, as you know, there are differential inflation rates for households in different circumstances, and the inflation rate we estimated was higher given the pressures, the particular price pressures on heating and food. It was higher for the poorest tenth of households, and we think that the inflation rate facing the poorest 10% of households has actually been cut by 6% as a result of this package. So it is a very significant intervention with very significant effects. And of course, if indeed inflation is held down in this type of way, that helps with a whole host of indices, which in turn drive public spending. This is what we thought before we had the package, and we believe that it's going to be better than that. There is this concentration of spending in the winter, of course. We think, for example, if you look at the January bill there, totalling almost £700, we think that for a typical household is now likely to be about £400, with a saving of about £280 in the most expensive month. So this, again, is a very significant intervention to make the winter much less severe for many households than it otherwise would have been. However, as well as that, there is the medium-term prospect over the life of the Parliament. Now, this chart is in 20ths. It shows for over the lifetime of Parliament each 20th of the income distribution. So that's the little coloured spectrum is actually 20 different, is a range of different bars. This was done before the latest package, so the actual figures for this current Parliament will be changed, but we continue to believe that they will be significantly negative. In other words, it will be a very different economic environment than one which Britain has seen for a very long time indeed. most households, and interestingly, contrary to some of the narratives you hear, actually the most affluent households hardest hit, but most households being worse off at the end of this Parliament than at the beginning of this Parliament. A very different political context than one we have seen before. And it's the interaction of what was already a very poor growth performance and then the impact of cost of living pressures as well. So a very sombre backdrop. And another way of looking at that is that just in terms of the value of average weekly earnings in real terms, again, you can see, and while the projection may change a bit in the light of today's announcement, you can see that the position is that we have, as an economy, found it very difficult to raise living standards from the level they had achieved just before the financial crash. And all of our analysis at Resolution Foundation brings this message home very clearly. It is proving very hard to get out of that position, and it looks as if at the end of this Parliament, real average weekly earnings will be no higher than they were before the financial crash in 2008. This is an appalling economic performance. It is a totally different context than the one we used to have before, and it brings Britain into the realm of some of the worst performing economies across Europe. So there's as well as helping out in this very dramatic way with the cost of living crisis this winter, the government also needs medium and longer term policies. And I'd just like to make a couple of comments about what those might be and the kind of long-term challenge that the government faces. One of the themes in the political debate at the moment is to what extent should we worry about inequality and to what extent should we focus simply on growth? And the next, this interesting quadrilateral just reminds us of Britain's position. So we're take us as that point in the middle of the quadrilateral. You want to be north of that. That means that you are more affluent. And if you're west of it, it also means that you have a narrower income distribution. And you can see that a very large number of advanced Western countries manage both to have a higher average disposable income than we do, and also to have a lower Gini coefficient for inequality than we do. So there is the challenge is to head northwest, and there can be legitimate political debate about how exactly you set about it and what the exact direction is, but surely most of us can agree that heading off into that northwest area with some improvements in both would be a benign and far superior outcome for the performance of the British economy. So this is one measure that I think brings across very vividly what a long-term problem we face. And my next chart is the other, I think, equally significant indicator of the problems we face. And this is, I think, in some ways, the most important indicator of how British political economy has changed in the last 30 years. This is the ratio of assets, wealth, to GDP. And wealth used to be about 3 times GDP. On our latest slightly provisional estimate at Resolution Foundation, it's soon going to be 8 times GDP. A society where wealth is 8 times GDP is completely different in its character from one which it's 3 times GDP. It means, for a start, that using your income in order to buy an asset is much harder. And of course, we all know the most vivid example of that, young people trying to save up to get a deposit to buy a flat or a house. It also means that inheritance matters a lot more. And I've noticed in the Conservative leadership election, which has just concluded, there was a lot of bandying around about what was a Thatcherite policy and what wasn't a Thatcherite policy. I can tell you, having worked for her, Margaret Thatcher would have not have thought that a society where earnings mattered less and inheritance mattered more was the direction in which she wished to take the UK. So this is a society where the best way to acquire assets is to inherit them, and trying to earn and work to acquire assets is harder. And incidentally, as well, just a final observation on this very important chart, because income is actually distributed rather more equally than assets, even if there is no change in the distribution of income and no change in the distribution of assets, but assets become much more significant relative to income, that society can feel less equal and more blocked, even though that would not show up in either of the specific measures of inequality that people use. So the relative weight of the less equal distribution is growing on this picture of Britain. So that is the analysis which informs the economic inquiry we are conducting with the LSE. Let me very briefly, let's just look through at some of the options. We've had this morning, of course, the bold action on the very short term. We've also, however, got to raise our performance in the medium term. And this is not impossible. We're not fundamentally pessimistic about this. This is just a reminder that there are many accounts of the future of the world economy in which the services sector grows. If you look at how we're to pay our way in the world, what we're going to sell to the growing economies of Asia, services matter. And by services, this is a broad interpretation of services. This is not just financial services, important though those are. It's everything from architecture to, dare I say, education. We are good at services. We are in a great sector to be focused on if you want to pay your way in the world. So we've got some comparative advantages that make us well suited for prospering. You could argue that Germany, with its comparative advantage in manufacturing, faces a greater long-term strategic challenge than we do with a comparative advantage in services. And secondly, paradoxically, one of the results, one of the consequences of our underperformance in the past 15 or 20 years is that all we need is a catch-up strategy. We do not need to be somehow at the head of the race, the best performing economy. All we need to do is do what you can see from here we did before. So if you look at our performance through, particularly interestingly, from about 1990 to sometime in the mid-2005 or so, you can see that the gap between our GDP per hour worked and France, Germany, and the US was narrowing. We were all getting closer together. This was a successful catch-up strategy, but we've gone off track. We've started falling behind again. The gap has started widening again, and that's what we have to do, is to narrow that gap by catching up with them. And that is not impossible. Let me end with the coming back to this challenge of an absolute performance measure and an equality measure by doing a little thought experiment which we have conducted with some figures behind it at resolution. So you imagine that you took our current income distribution and simply catch up with some advanced nations. And that, of course, as you see, it's almost just a matter of arithmetic. That means all those three groups, low, middle income, all have about a 20% increase in their incomes. Secondly, imagine you have no improvement in your economic performance, but you shift to being as egalitarian as those countries are. And by the way, when I say it's egalitarian, I'm not talking about some socialist nirvana or nightmare, however you see it. I'm talking about the levels of inequality you see in Australia, Canada, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. So this should not be too scary a prospect for equality. If we just had no improvement in economic performance, but by some extraordinary powerful intervention, reduced our income gaps to those of the other countries, then you see in the middle what happens. And you would see our most affluent fifth significantly losing, and you would see people in the middle gaining much less, but people at the bottom in the red gaining. Imagine that you did both of those things. Imagine we properly got into that northwest area, and you both caught up with the economic performance of those countries, and you achieved their levels of equality. That's the chart on the right. And of course, it's particularly the low-income the low-income group in the red who do the best. But what's really interesting, I think, thinking of the drama and the tensions and competitiveness of politics, look what's happened to the middle-income group in that scenario. That is a very significant, over 30% improvement of people in the middle of the income scale. And I think that different political parties can argue about the relative weight to the group on the left and the pattern in the middle, but if we could really get to that pattern on the right, it would be fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Just before I turn to the commentators, if you have questions, please submit them via Slido. And if the tech people could just perhaps, thank you. So for those of you not familiar with the technology, you use your camera to take a picture of the QR code, up pops Slido, and then you can put your questions into Slido. And if you don't have questions yourselves, you can vote on questions that other people have submitted. They magically come up on the iPad in front of me, and I will try and read out as many of those questions as we can get through. So, Julian, do you want to go next?
Right, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to focus on three things. First of all, the energy plan that's just been announced. The second is the overall sort of fiscal monetary policy mix under the new government. And the third is the importance of supply-side reforms. First of all, on the energy plan, I've actually just come from a meeting at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which, as you know, is sometimes described as right-wing. I think we prefer to describe it as sort of free market think tank. And it's often suggested that Liz Truss is in thrall to free market think tanks. Well, I can tell you that nobody in the IEA is happy with this. I mean, many of them are completely livid that she's basically just announced an unlimited blank cheque, another massive state intervention that provides support to every household regardless of need, and which also could be potentially hugely expensive. And I also think that, over the last few weeks, almost every think tank, including the IEA, but also Resolution Foundation, Policy Exchange, and so on, all coming up with what, on paper at least, were better plans of targeted support for the most vulnerable households, whether that's additional top-ups to benefits or social tariffs or some form of tiered pricing. I think there are an awful lot of better ideas out there. That said, I grudgingly support what has just been announced for two reasons. First of all, simply the scale of this potential crisis coming down the line. Not just, of course, an enormous economic shock, but the impact on people's welfare over the winter, people not being able to pay their bills. We're no longer talking, even if we ever were, just about the most vulnerable households on low incomes, a massive hit to middle income as well. So I think the scale of the crisis required a really bold response, and one in particular that ended the uncertainty. I mean, we don't know whether the final cost is going to be X billion or Y billion, but at least we know that cost is going to be met by the government rather than individual households and businesses. The second reason why I like it is that if you think about the various scenarios, actually that uncertainty, the fact that's landing on the government is no bad thing. I suspect the cost of this will be nearer X, the lower number, because wholesale gas prices will fall further than the markets currently anticipate, in which case, in that sense, we've dodged a bullet. But in the scenario where energy prices do remain high, the government would have to come up with all sorts of forms of additional support anyway. And whatever plan it did have in place, whether that's topping up benefits or targeted tax cuts, whatever else, it would have to keep repeating and refining that plan, constantly adding to it. So in a sense, we've taken out a big insurance policy, the government has, to prevent a worst-case scenario. So I think it's the right thing to do. Interestingly, the market reaction to this has been, fairly sanguine. I know we have all the headlines about sterling crashing to a multi-decade low against the dollar, and it has certainly weakened than it would otherwise have been because of political uncertainty and worries about other things going on. But the bond market has taken this reasonably well. So the government's cost of borrowing over 10 years is still only about 3%, despite all the uncertainty about the cost of this. I think the markets are accepting that this is a one-off emergency measure to deal with what is basically a wartime cost. And the markets seem okay with the idea of adding this to long-term borrowing. And I think that's probably the right solution. The second issue is the overall fiscal and monetary policy mix, which I personally think is part of the problem that we're in, that we have had this long period of sluggish growth in productivity, and the Treasury orthodoxy has been proved wrong. There's something going wrong, and that's one of the things that Liz Truss has been very clear on, that she wants to think about things differently. In terms of fiscal policy, I think that means that the government will be a lot more relaxed about short-term borrowing. The deficit will have to take the strain, particularly during crises like this. But there will still be a strong commitment to long-term sustainability of the public finances, which basically means keeping the debt to GDP ratio down and ideally falling over time. There will need to be a credible medium to longer term plan in place to deal with that, and clearly there isn't one at the moment, but I think that will be a priority over the next few weeks and months to put that in place. The other part of this is monetary policy. Like most economists, I think that fiscal policy has been tightened prematurely, but monetary policy has been too loose. So I think one of the things that will end up as a result of this is looser fiscal policy, slightly tighter monetary policy. I personally think that is the right mix. In the short term, the government has clearly had some hard work to do to reassure the markets that it's not going to trample all over the independence of the Bank of England. It's clear that the Bank of England is going to remain in charge of setting interest rates and quantitative easing and quantitative tightening. So there's no real threat to the independence there. I also think the inflation target will stay as it is, for now at least, partly because it's not obvious what the alternative would be. But also because I think actually you've got a reasonable chance of hitting it now. I think inflation will be down to 2% by the end of next year. So to some extent you say, it's broken at the moment, but it's going to fix itself. So let's keep it for now. The final point is about supply side reform. Nobody, including on the Trust team, thinks that just cutting taxes is enough. You need to do lots of other things as well. Starting, by the way, with the energy market. You need to fix the supply side problems in the energy market. A whole load of other things as well, though. The housing market, clearly a major contributor to the cost of living, is the high price of housing and the knock-on effects of that on rent. Also, infrastructure spending. One of the casualties of Treasury orthodoxy, particularly over the last decade, has been cuts in capital budgets, which, might look good in terms of reducing the budget deficit in the short term, but we see the problems that it's causing for whether that's the NHS or the transport system or whatever else it is. So I think there'll be more flexibility around infrastructure spending in particular, and getting the overall level of investment up in the economy, whether that's public investment or private investment. That's the broad outlines of what I think Trussonomics is going to be about, but happy to hear what others say as well.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Just to remind you again, please ask questions on Slido. I know it's clunky for those of you not familiar with it, but because this is a hybrid event, it gives people who are watching online an opportunity to participate as well. Jonathan.
Thanks. So I'm going to briefly sort of comment on Julian's remarks about fiscal policy, which I agree with to some extent, and I think actually our views have converged on this quite a lot, but sort of raising some difficult questions which I don't think have been answered yet, and then talk a bit more about the longer term challenges. So I think that as Julian had said, it is really an astonishing, missed opportunity that we had 10 years of really low interest rates when the government could essentially borrow for nothing. And we did not do the sort of investment in our infrastructure that would have done something to sustain our long-term growth rate. And we are now being much more relaxed about fiscal policy, but we're being much more relaxed about fiscal policy at a time when that constraint has that lack of constraint is no longer with us, because we are no longer at the zero lower bound for interest rates, and indeed, as Julian said, gilt yields have risen quite significantly, not to the point where we should panic as yet, but things are, there is a lot more reason to be nervous about the rise in interest rates, about borrowing, than there was for most of the last 10 years. And so gilt yields have gone up to about 3%, which is not in itself a disaster, but they have gone up significantly more than either the US or or our main European comparators over the past month. So this isn't just the rise in global interest rates. To the extent that that goes alongside the fall in the pound, which again, as Julian said, is not just a UK story, it is mostly, but not exclusively, a dollar story, there is a sense in which there is less confidence in the UK economy. And that is not yet a disaster, but is certainly a concern. And it could become more of a concern. It will become more of a concern if the Bank of England is perceived to be falling into what economists call fiscal dominance. And fiscal dominance is a sort of fancy-sounding technical term, but what it essentially means is that fiscal dominance is what happens when the Bank of England starts setting interest rates in monetary policy based not on its inflation objective, but because it needs to do so to stop the to ensure that the government can continue to sell its debt. And so yesterday, when the governor said that actually they might reconsider the pace of that fiscal expansion, meaning we had to sell more gilts, might lead the bank to reconsider the pace of quantitative tightening, the extent to which the bank reverses quantitative easing. That, for me, in itself is not a disaster, but it's quite a worrying sign, because he's essentially saying, I would like to tighten monetary policy by reversing QE, but I can't because the government needs to sell more gilts. And that is not really where the bank ought to be. It may have, these were off-the-cuff remarks, so I won't read too much into it. But if we go down that road, then we very quickly get into a position where the risks rise. And here, I think, is where I come on to my differences with Julian, which is much more about the medium to long term, which is that I think we all recognize, I agree entirely, I think, pretty much with Julian, which is that any economist would have come up with something better than today's plan. But given the politics, I think at some point economists have to throw up our hands and say, look, we're not in charge here, and there are reasons we're not in charge here. So we are where we are. So you have to have a large fiscal expansion and a large expansion of borrowing in the short term. You do not have to have large permanent tax cuts. And for Julian to say, well, yes, but our plan is still to get the debt to GDP ratio down over the longer term, but to say, and I will do that by introducing large permanent tax cuts, the national insurance cut, and then cancelling the planned increases in corporation tax, without any plan, as far as we know, to cut back on public spending, which seems to me highly implausible in political terms, given the demographic pressures, given what we know about where the NHS is and other public services, and given the only public spending pledge that the Prime Minister has made, which is to increase defence spending by some very large amount of money, unspecified or hard to assess. In those circumstances, saying, yes, but we're still committed to get the debt to GDP ratio down, doesn't really cut much ice. It just doesn't add up. And I think the fact doesn't add up over the medium to long term is in some sense more worrying about than the fact that we are, for quite good political reasons, going to have to borrow some money in the quite a lot of money in the short term. So those are, as I say, I'm not sure I have the answers here, but I think those are some reasons to be quite seriously concerned about the potential downside risk to macroeconomic policy. We are not in a crisis yet. I saw some absurd article that we would have to go, that we might end up going to the IMF for a bailout again. I don't think that, that is not what I'm worried about. But the risks of macroeconomic stability are rather larger than they have been in some time. And then just finally, I agree entirely with what David said about the sort of long-term strategy, or where we should be trying to go. The question is, of course, how we get there, and there's not a, first of all, David didn't have time, and second of all, the Resolution Foundation is still working on what the long-term strategy is. But I think the basic point that there are things that we do very well. Those are primarily in the high productivity service sector, and we have to figure out how to do more of that. And that the answer there is not primarily the tax system, or even supply side reform. It's certainly not removing labor market regulations or whatever. It's quite a lot more complicated than that. Is I think something that one hopes that the government will get its head around quite quickly. But I've probably exceeded my time, so I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. David, did you want to respond briefly to either the comments you just heard?
Yeah, and look, I think they were very informative comments. I would make three quick comments. First of all, on capital investment, I think actually both Julian and Jonathan were a bit harsh. Successive chancellors, beginning with George Osborne, have absolutely tried to push up capital investment. And you look at their budget plans, you see they've been trying to do public sector capital investment running at 3% of GDP, which is really very respectable by Britain's post-war performance. Their frustration is that actually getting the money spent, which they allocate to capital investment, has proved extremely difficult. And I don't know if this is one of the interpretations of Julian's reference to supply-side reform, but I know it's just harder to do things. And I can remember cabinets in George's day where did and have announced a big increase in capital spend. He completely understood that interest rates were low, it's a good time to do it. But actually getting the houses built, the railways constructed, takes a hell of a long time now in Britain. Secondly, yeah, I mean, at the Resolution, like other think tanks, we had some ingenious ideas. We had a social tariff. We then got into the issue, if you help low-income people with higher benefits, what about the families who are just above benefits? And we then agonized about the fact that within the poorest deciles, there's quite a wide distribution of the energy cost effect, depending on size of household. There's all that kind of stuff. But even as we wrote it, and we produced a paper on this a couple of weeks ago, I could just see a harassed minister wanting to get something done in the next 4 weeks would have seen our carefully constructed policy wonkery, like from other excellent think tanks as well, just too hard to implement compared with something as brutally simple and interventionist as this. And then we may turn to the whole supply side agenda, but absolutely in our work with the LSE, this is a low mobility economy. And now, there are proper economists in the room, but just to try out a thought. And one of the issues is I don't think relative price signals have been working very well in a moribund economy. One of the advantages, I must choose my words carefully, one of the opportunities provided by a brief period of high inflation is it makes relative price changes easier to get away with. Trying to change relative prices when the underlying rate of inflation is 1 is a jolly sight harder than when the underlying rate of inflation is 10%. So who knows? If I, again, trying to find a silver lining to the current cloud, we may end up at the end of this crisis with just a little bit more of a shake-up of relative prices.
Thank you very much. What I'll do now is I'll come to a couple of the questions that have come in, and unless, Julian, you wanted to have anything else you want to say?
Oh, just I think Jonathan was very kind saying our views have converged. I think it's more that I've moved towards you than everyone else.
Very courteous.
Marvellous. So one of the questions that have come in is, should the government introduce a windfall tax, as advocated by Keir Starmer, or is Liz Truss correct that it would deter investment despite BP comments to the contrary?
Shall I have a go?
Yeah.
Yeah. Not the first time I've been asked that question. I think it's a very fair one, actually. As an economist, I can see the appeal of a windfall tax. It clearly is perceived as being fair, but also economically it might be efficient because, basically, if it is a genuine one-off tax and is recognised as such, then it's basically a tax on the profits you're making from past investment rather than necessarily something that would deter you from investing more in future. So I think the the economic case for a windfall tax is actually pretty strong. That said, I'm not enthusiastic about this sort of huge excess profits narrative that is currently being pushed by some opposition politicians. You will have seen figures suggesting that there's excess profits of, say, 170, 180 billion that surely we could get our hands on. A number of problems on that. First of all, those are typically global profits. They're not necessarily the profits that companies are making from selling oil and gas into the UK. So not all of those figures not all of that is taxable by the UK government. The second point is that we do already have quite high levels of taxation on North Sea oil gas producers in particular, including the existing windfall tax. They're actually paying a tax rate of something like 65%. So a lot of money is already going to be flowing into the exchequer as a result of higher prices. And then the third thing is more sort of economicsy. I don't like this concept of excess profits. I mean, there are certainly higher profits than normal and maybe higher profits than expected. But profits always ebb and flow with the business cycle. Companies will have good years and they will have bad years. That many of these companies were making big losses 3 or 4 years ago during the global crisis. If you say that you are going to tax profits at a higher level whenever profits are a bit better than normal, then you will lower the expected rate of return on investment. And it's hard to see how that doesn't have some impact on future investment. Plus, there's the slippery slope argument, which I know is often overused, but once we start imposing additional windfall taxes on any sector that is doing well, what next? What about online retailers, for example, that did particularly well during the pandemic? What about banks that might be benefiting now from higher interest rates? And I think adding to the existing windfall taxes would send a pretty negative signal to businesses looking to invest in the UK. So I understand the position of the government, but equally I also understand why, if there is ever a time for additional windfall taxes, then this does seem to be the sort of textbook case of when they might be appropriate.
Do you converge on that, Jonathan?
Basically, yes. I think there's a very strong case for it, but we shouldn't pretend, but the 170 billion figure is just obviously nonsense. So, I think it's probably the right thing to do, but we shouldn't pretend that it's going to solve the problem or anything like it.
David?
Yeah, I think these are the circumstances which warrant a windfall tax, as we did in the early 80s with banks who were making exceptional profits because of the high interest rates, and more recently, indeed, with energy and oil. These are profits created entirely by a very peculiar shift in prices, no change in their costs of production. And this is money that's going to have to be borrowed otherwise, and some of it's going to be borrowed, but if you can get a contribution from a genuine defensible tax, I think that would help.
Thank you. No event hosted by the UK in Change Europe would be complete without at least some reference to Brexit. And one of the Brexit questions that have come in is, have things been made worse? This is from Mark English. How much of an obstacle to a putative UK catch-up strategy is self-exclusion from the EU single market and the comparative disadvantage this entails for UK business? David, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, the Brexit trade deal was not at all helpful for the British services industry, and an architect trying to win a contract in the EU now faces significant barriers and has no rights of access to that market at all, and I think that is a real cost. So yes, it has been very unhelpful for our specialism. Of course, the Brexiteers would say, but the big market is Asia, and certainly you must hope that these services can be expanded onto Asia, but it is services as well as manufacturing. It's quite useful to be able to sell to your neighbours. So it's been that problem. And Brexit, the two economic indicators that moved very rapidly after Brexit were business investment. So going back to our other discussion of capital investment, actually the story of investment in Britain recently is how much of it has had to be done by the public sector and how the amount done by the business sector has fallen. And that was a step change post-Brexit, which hasn't been reversed. And of course, the fall in the value of the pound post-Brexit has meant that the further step change we've gone through recently has taken us down to very low levels. So there are some of those factors which I think it's very... we can try to overcome them, we can do our best, but they don't help.
Thank you. Do you disagree?
Well, it's a tricky one. First of all, the initial impact of Brexit on the UK economy has definitely been negative, as you would expect, because all that's basically happened for now is that we've raised trade barriers with our biggest single trading partner. So Economics 101 is that that's going to be negative in all sorts of ways, including the hits to investment and having a weaker currency than you would otherwise have done. So to that extent, I absolutely agree. Where I probably disagree is on two things. First of all is the size and duration of those negative impacts. I mean, including, by the way, on investment and on the currency. I think that the pound was overvalued going into the referendum anyway, so it would have fallen, probably not as quickly or as far, but it would have fallen anyway. And as for investment, we were at an unusual stage in the investment cycle where if you simply start the chart from shortly before the referendum, the fall looks very big. If you take a longer view, then we're actually not that far below where you might otherwise have expected us to be. So I would disagree about the magnitude of the impact. I'd also disagree about the duration of the negatives. I think a lot of them are to do with uncertainty. Much as Boris Johnson liked to claim that Brexit was done, of course it isn't. I mean, we've still got the uncertainty of the Northern Ireland Protocol and lots of our individual relationships in particular sectors with Europe still to be sorted out. So there's still a big overhang of uncertainty, which I think needs to be fixed. And then we've not yet even begun really to explore the potential benefits of Brexit. Now, I know Jonathan and I will disagree on the potential magnitude of these, but there are some in terms of lowering trade barriers with the rest of the world and doing things differently and better, hopefully, in terms of regulation as well. So I'm still optimistic that, over the next, 5, 10, 15 years, the initial negative hit from Brexit will turn into a positive. But in the short term, yes, it's another headwind for the economy. There's no doubt about that. I mean, anybody who talks to anybody in the business community or anybody looking to invest in the UK, then clearly Brexit is still one of their top concerns. And I think it's be bonkers not to recognise that.
So could we just push up just a bit further, because clearly even Lord Frost has admitted that the services part of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was perhaps not his finest hour. And we've heard from David Willits that it's causing severe difficulty. Do you think there will be a change of approach under the Liz Truss government to take a more positive approach in its relationship with the EU?
I think it's genuinely hard to say. I think the thing I'd focus on first of all, of course, is the Northern Ireland Protocol. That will be the sort of touchstone for what her approach is going to be. She has talked very tough about the need to, probably to take a tough line with Europe to get the Northern Protocol fixed. But equally, there's a reluctance to add to the problems that are in her in tray at the moment. So I suspect that she will go slow on the Northern Ireland Protocol and try and be a bit more conciliatory. Now she's moving from campaign politics, as people call it, to sort of governing economics. So I think she'll be cautious about inflaming tensions any further with the rest of Europe. But if push comes to shove, then she herself may not have been a Brexiteer during the campaign. But given that where we are, I don't think she's going to row back on the idea that we have big opportunities here in terms of free trade with the rest of the world and setting our own regulations. And if that means loosening the ties with Europe, then so be it.
I'd like to come back to you because I've got questions on free trade in a moment. But Jonathan, do you want to say anything about the issues that we've just single market primarily?
A couple of things. In fact, I just published an article this morning, so I'm going to advertise for that on the CEPR website on trade, migration and Brexit. I'd make 2 points. First of all, I mean, I basically agree with Julian about the short-term impacts. They are there, but they're not, but they have been exaggerated in some quarters. I think what's worrying for me is that, as Julian says, Econ 101 says that raising trade barriers with your largest trading partner is going to reduce trade. And that's what the model said, and that's what's happened. The slightly puzzling thing is that it also said, well, we're going to raise trade barriers with Europe, and we're going to reduce trade barriers with the rest of the world, certainly not increase them. So hopefully we'll get at least a bit of a countervailing increase. So far, our exports to the rest of the world have performed just as badly as our exports to Europe. That's really worrying. It's also worrying because we economists don't really know why that is the case. The overall decline in trade is pretty much what was forecast by the consensus. In fact, the OBR have said, well, basically it's exactly what we said it was. But the composition of that fall is quite different, and we don't understand why. And if we are going to, by necessity, reorient to the rest of the world, we need to understand why our performance post-Brexit in terms of exporting to the rest of the world has been relatively poor, and considerably poorer than virtually every other advanced economy. So that's on the trade front. And I'm going to be positive here, as many people will know. By contrast, on the migration front, again, we expected some reorientation of migration from the EU to outside the EU, but not by nearly enough to make up for the loss of migration from the EU. And there, I guess, because I'm probably the person who's done the most looking at the numbers here, was significantly too pessimistic. We've got a significantly more liberal system than I predicted, and we are seeing at the moment really quite high levels of skilled migration, particularly in the health, IT, finance, and business sector, services sectors, all the sectors where we want, where we are good at and we want to be good at, and we need people, and we need skilled workers. That expansion's happened much faster, much more quickly, and to a much higher level than I would have expected, either economically or politically. And that potentially is really good news. And similarly, in the universities, where pessimists like me would say, well, if we're going to have a bloody hard time making up for the loss of EU students by expanding to international students, and yet we have more than made up for it so far, with a really large expansion in the number of international students under the new system. And as David said, very much one of our most successful export sectors. So if this can be sustained and we can make it work, the new migration system post-Brexit is a genuine sort of supply-side deregulatory gain, or whatever you want to call it, that at least in part is might compensate for some of the downsides.
So just to come in on that, I think that is an important plus. I've read some appalling nonsense, particularly in things like the New York Times, about how Liz Truss is one of her guiding principles is driven by whatever Enoch Powell said donkeys years ago, that she's anti-immigrant and all that sort of nonsense. Absolutely not true. And I think there is going to be hopefully more flexibility on labour market policy. So replicating, if you like, that element of the single market, not necessarily the other bits. So I think that is a positive. There is a recognition that that there does need to be more flexibility on both sides, and hopefully maintaining good relations with Europe will allow us encourage them to be more flexible towards our relations with them. But in the meantime, I suspect that we will be more flexible when push comes to shove on individual problems in the UK labour market in terms of visa flexibility and things like that.
Thank you very much. I wanted to come back to this question of opportunities created by free trade deals since we've left the customs union. And I imagine you'd like to reflect on that, but the specific question I've got from Ray is, now that Steve Baker has been appointed to the Northern Ireland office, does it mean that we are inevitably heading for a trade war with the EU and the USA, and does that damage our chances of having a trade deal with the US?
I think it's largely a political question rather than an economic one, but to the extent I have looked at it, I think a lot of the fears about a trade war are exaggerated. There are, actually, Catherine, you're far more about this than I do, but simply triggering the relevant clauses of under Article 16 do not in themselves allow Europe to go ahead and impose massive tariff barriers and so on. There's a negotiated process. Anything that the EU does in response has to be proportionate to whatever the UK has done. There are lots of checks and balances in there. I would very much hope that both sides would see that there's nothing to be gained on either side from starting a major trade war. So I think that risk is relatively small. I suspect also it's probably not a risk that the government will want to take in the short term, given everything else that is going on. But in terms of the economics of it, I'm sort of reassured that it will be mutually assured destruction for both sides to launch a trade war, so I don't think that will happen.
Thank you. And just, of course, just to be clear, of course, the government has not triggered Article 16. And although there's obviously we keep hearing stories that it's about to or it's not, the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill has been laid in the context of Article 25 of the Articles of State Responsibility, not Article 16, on the grounds of necessity. The very fact that it's now 3 months in does seem to undermine this necessity argument, but it's not Article 16. David, did you want to say something about trade deals with the US and particularly the political slant that Ray asks about Steve Baker?
Well, there's still no prospect of a kind of trade deal with the US anytime soon. The one comment I'd make about Northern Ireland, and of course there are very intricate political issues for the unionists in the settlement that they've ended up with. But my recollection of the economic data, and Jonathan will correct me if I'm wrong, is that in the last couple of years, GDP per head in Northern Ireland has outperformed Great Britain. So this arrangement, however politically complex and satisfactory it may be, is some evidence that the access to European markets has proved to be an advantage. Now, there are some very peculiar features of Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland trade, but the Northern Ireland economy seems to be doing slightly better than for the rest of us.
Thank you. Jonathan?
Well, I think Julian wants to come back on that point, and I'm probably in the middle, so I'll let Julian do. I don't want to say anything about Steve
I
Baker.
have looked at this evidence of Northern Irish outperformance. It is true that Northern Ireland has outperformed the rest of the UK, but as far as I remember from the latest data, it's actually underperformed against Wales. And I think there's clearly lots of other things going on. So Northern Ireland, for various reasons, was hit less hard by the pandemic than the rest of the United Kingdom. It has a larger state sector, larger government sector than the rest of the United Kingdom. So in those circumstances, you would have expected to do relatively well. I'd also say that the GDP numbers that we're talking about, the regional GDP numbers, are a little bit shaky. There are other indicators as well. For example, there's the Purchasing Managers Index compiled by a firm called S&P Global, which is a sort of a composite index of business activity. Northern Ireland has consistently underperformed on the basis of that index on everything, output orders, employment, and also price pressures over the last several years. So there are alternative economic indicators suggesting that Northern Ireland has actually underperformed. So I think the best you can say is that GDP data are sort of consistent with the idea that the Northern Ireland might have had a big benefit from the single market. But there are other alternative explanations for why the Northern Ireland might have outperformed the average, and other indicators that suggest actually Northern Ireland is continuing to underperform.
Thank you. And Jonathan, can I turn to you, and can I just get you to try and address head-on Ray's question about the benefits of a trade deal with the US and elsewhere, and also whether Steve Baker's presence makes that more difficult?
I mean, I met Steve Baker once when he was still arguing strongly that we should return to the gold standard. And I'm happy to say that I don't think that's a good idea, but don't think I have anything to say about what he might do in Northern Ireland. I mean, on the US, I mean, I think, as David says, we're not going to have a trade deal with the US anytime soon. But it's not, even if the Northern Ireland problem were to magically go away, it's pretty, it's not going to happen anytime soon. I mean, it's much more interesting, actually, to think about whether the trade deal with India, which, against almost everybody's expectations, seems to be proceeding quite rapidly and may actually happen. Now, of course, none of us really know what's in it and whether it will be, because there are trade deals and trade deals. Some have more impact than others. But that potentially is in some sense, I think, a much bigger deal than the putative prospect of some US trade deal sometime in the future.
Can I just add one other point? Because we were asked about the politics of it, and there's another quite interesting political angle from the Australian trade deal, where the UK position was indeed a proper purist free trade position. We weren't going to protect our agricultural industry over time or anything like that. There's certainly, I think, a view amongst Tory MPs that one of the reasons for the Lib Dem revival in places like the South West is anxiety in the agricultural community about the Australian deal. And I have had Tory MPs say to me that they regard this is one of the things that the Lib Dems, with their extraordinary capacity to find whatever is a vulnerability, wherever it may be on the political spectrum, but they would be very surprised if a Conservative government did any other trade deal like the Australian one, given its political costs in rural England.
Thank you. Could I now turn to Lindsay Sweeney's question, which is about net zero? She asks, can we meet net zero 2050 target in an economically efficient way, as the government's news today states, or is net zero now at odds with saving the economy? Do you want to start, Jim?
Well, as I understand it, the Liz Truss recommitted today to net zero. It is in the Conservative Manifesto, the one that the last government was elected on, and I'm sure it will be in the next one. So there's politically the commitment is still there. I think we'll need to be smarter about how we reach it. I should really have spent more time looking into the issues here than I have done, but obviously with everything else going on, it's been hard. But my understanding of net zero, of course, is it's not just about reducing emissions, it's also about finding more ways to take the carbon that you have emitted into the environment out. So I'm a big fan of looking much more closely at carbon capture, big program of investment in carbon capture. So that doesn't hit the economy in the same way as reducing activity to reduce emissions would do. Instead, it's a way of making sure that those emissions that you do produce, they're taken out of the environment much more quickly than they would otherwise have done. So that's the other side of the net zero, not the emissions, but the reduction in the amount of carbon being pumped into the environment. So if I were advising the government, I would say, look very, very hard at a major program of investment in carbon capture as a way of achieving net zero without having the same negative impact on businesses and consumers as some of the existing plans might do.
Thank you. Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm not entirely convinced by that, in that there was, the last time I was in government, which is now quite a long time ago, we talked a lot about carbon capture and storage, and my impression is that, that was 12 or 13 years ago. Despite a lot of effort, it's not clear to me that the technology has really, advanced to the point where it's economic, whereas over the last 12 or 13 years, we have built an awful lot of renewable power. And it does seem that actually the UK is quite good at building renewable power when we put our minds to it. So it seems to me that actually, that there are obviously sort of two competing narratives about what the current crisis means, with one side saying, well, it means that we need to go much slower on net zero, we have to recognize that we need lots more fossil fuels in the short term and more security of supply, and the other side saying, well, this just means we need to be more serious about getting to net zero and reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, and in particular gas for electricity generation. And I think whatever you think about the sort of short term, it seems to me the medium to long term, the second argument is much more powerful. We need, this crisis, and one of the regrets, in a sense, of the package is that that by not allowing price signals to operate, that you inhibit the pressure to do that. You would like to see actually. And one shouldn't overstate that, because prices will still be going up a lot, and hopefully that does indeed increase the incentive for us to find ways of generating power with very low or no carbon, whether that's wind or nuclear.
David?
Yes, thank you. This is one of the important strands in our economic inquiry. I mean, one of our papers for it is, our estimate is that the cost of moving to net zero, the investment cost required, is 1.4 trillion, which sounds like a hell of a lot of money, because it is quite a lot of money, over 20, 25 years. But that yields us operational cost saving of 1.1 trillion. So the economic proposition is not absurd or impossible over time. My frustration as we've gone through this crisis, and I think, to be honest, the worst offender in this was was Rishi, and Kwasi today has done a bit better. Rishi's big bang package of about 30 billion in the spring had nothing in it about any form of green energy, alternative energy, lowering costs. And I remember talking to the Treasury at the time about why there wasn't anything on home insulation or more green power. And they said, it was very revealing, they said, we're not convinced that there is the skilled manpower to install anything we would wish to install, which is a terrible reflection on the performance of the British labour market. And of course, we know, I'm doubtless scarred by frustrating experiences with green deals in the past. Kwasi, who has been the energy minister, I think today there is some of that. I'm not particularly excited by fracking myself, but going back to Britain's comparative advantages in the future, we ought to be investing, and it's a perfectly reasonable strategy. And I think they've set the ambition of being a net exporter of energy in 20 years. And you can imagine with an island with tidal power, wind power, that should be a deliverable proposition.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we're down to our last 10 minutes or so, and there's a question I'll start with for David. It comes, well, several questions essentially around the same theme. One about has levelling up met its maker? And I should just say that there is a UK and a Changing Europe report just about to come out on levelling up, where there's some excellent work being done. But is levelling up now very last year? And a related question from Perry Ismangill, and apologies if I've mispronounced that, has inequality become a dirty word in this government?
Inequality or equality?
Well, yes, equality, he says.
Right. On levelling up, well, if you try, and as I said, our research is looking through this at the moment, but if you think that this price cap particularly helps badly insulated houses in cold areas, if anything, modestly geographically redistributive to helping people in the north more than the south is our instinctive reaction to the package. I do think that there's a question about whether there's sufficient firepower behind levelling up, but in the different policy discussions I see, I think that issue is still very alive and people are very aware of it. So wearing a different hat on the board of UKRI, we're thinking quite hard about the distribution of our R&D spend. To what extent should it go to the Golden Triangle, this incredibly dynamic cluster of London, Oxford, Cambridge? To what extent, without sacrificing standards, can we be more imaginative in supporting R&D activities across the country? And that is, I think many agencies are thinking like that. So I think it's a real issue. And on equality, inequality, if you formulate it in a slightly different way as living standards for the less affluent half of the population, and certainly people care about that. Then you can have a lively debate about the extent to which you can achieve that simply by reducing inequality. But the sense that we've now got in Britain some people left behind, the lowest income 20%, whose living standards are significantly lower than in many other advanced Western countries. And that is a challenge, which again, I don't think can be shirked. And to be fair to them, I don't think ministers would wish to shirk it.
Thank you, Johnson.
I think that there is a real tension here. How it will be resolved, I don't know. I mean, if you read, and I'm sure all of you read Mr. Gove's white paper on levelling up with its, Mr. Gove and Mr. Haldane's paper on levelling up with its, even longer than all your reports piled on top of each other, David, I think, which had a lot of very interesting stuff, whether you agreed with it or not. But it was not I would say, something that would come from people, it would not have been published by the IEA, put it that way.
Or indeed UK and a Changing Europe, whose reports are extremely accessible and short.
Right. Not because of length, but because there is a sort of fundamental philosophy about whether, what is the role of government, what can be achieved by an interventionist state. So I think there is a real tension there between the vision of levelling up, and I mean, now it's true, and I think David is sort of implicitly saying this, it doesn't mean you can't square that circle. So, for example, policies that really, supply-side policies that really drove the reduced educational inequalities in particular are perfectly respectable free market supply-side policies, but would also have the impact of levelling up. But they do require, if not a big state, certainly quite an interventionist one and a competent one. So I think there's definitely a tension there. How it will be resolved, I don't know.
So can you square that circle?
Panel to this, and there was somebody from a charity who was introduced as being a anti-poverty campaigner. And then I was introduced as coming from the other side.
Seems fair.
The aim of free market economics is not to increase poverty. It's another way of tackling it. I mean, you all know the story. If you give a man a fish, he can eat for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he can feed himself and his family for forever. So I think you need a combination of strategies. You definitely need a redistributive strategy. A competent state, as Jonathan put it, to make sure that people do have a basic minimum standard of living. But also you need the right fundamentals in the economy to provide people with the right incentives and opportunities to pull themselves out of poverty. I don't think it's an either or. I will say, I don't recognise at all this new narrative of so-called trickle-down economics. I mean, I think trickle-down economics, the idea seems to be you give lots of rich people money and then they spend it and that helps everybody else, which we know doesn't really make sense, because if you want to boost spending, you give it to poor people who are more likely to spend it than save it. But I think there is a role for tax cuts as part of the overall strategy here to improve the supply-side performance of the economy, to get the incentives right, both for households and for businesses. So I think it's a bit of everything. I mean, I think there are things that you could take from a policy programme produced by the IEA, as well as a policy programme produced by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation or the Resolution Foundation or UK and the Changing Europe. I think you need to be willing to touch pull all of the levers to solve these problems. That does mean that taxes will be higher in future than they would otherwise have been, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have big increases in tax if you can grow the economy and reduce the burden of debt relative to the size of the economy over time. Now that, of course, is the big challenge. It's easier said than done, but I think if you are facing a crisis like the one we're doing at the moment, then borrowing a bit more money over 10, 20, 30 years at 3% is probably the least bad of the various options. Certainly raising taxes aggressively in the short term would clearly be counterproductive. I know some people have suggested the Bank of England should just print another 200 billion to deal with the problem, which is an odd solution at a time when inflation's already 10%. But I simply don't see any alternative other than the government, which has got broader shoulders than individual households and businesses taking on that burden.
Okay, thank you. David?
Whose work has to service that debt. The young Robin Day gave a famous interviewed the, I think Lord Cromer, the then Governor of the Bank of England, and asked him, have we paid for the Second World War? To which Cromer said no. And have we paid for the First World War? To which Cromer said no. And then he said, have we paid for the Napoleonic Wars? To which Cromer said, yes, I think so. So there is a cost that eventually will be borne by someone. It will be future generations. A big war is the kind of thing that indeed future generations accept they have to pay for. And this is an acute crisis. And I wouldn't have wished to see a big increase in taxes today. But as I said earlier, actually, I do think a windfall tax, when there are some very extraordinary profits being made in very extraordinary circumstances, has been used before by governments of different persuasions. And that, I think, would have been a way of lowering the amount of debt we impose on future generations.
Finally, Jonathan.
I agree with both Julian and David in the short term. In the medium to long term, though, I come back that I do disagree with Julian in the sense that not that making the tax system better isn't a good supply-side strategy. It is. There are lots of things about the tax system which would be more pro-growth, and some areas where you could cut or smooth out taxes. But it seems to me that over the medium to the long term, that taxes have to go up if we want to sustain the sort of welfare state that I think politically is likely to be what the British people want and need, given demographic and other social pressures. Unless we do what some people at the IA would want and privatise the health service in some way or do something like that, then I think that there is no getting around the fact that we'll need some sort of increases in taxation over the medium to long term. And simply saying that we're going to grow our way out of it, or that we're going to reduce debt to GDP over the long term, doesn't get us there.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. Our time has come to an end. I want to say thank you very much indeed to all of our speakers for being both engaging and willing to take a stance on these difficult matters. Thank you to you, the audience, and including those online, and for those asking questions. Thank you also to the organisers, both from UK and a Changing Europe, from the Resolution Foundation, and from About Onward. I advise you to look at all of our respective websites, and so you can see the next events. But for now, thank you very much indeed.
started. I am obviously not Paula Surridge. I apologize for that. I'm Jonathan Portis. For those of you who are in the last panel, who are here for the previous panel already know that. But I'm taking off my economist hat and putting on my more general UK in a changing Europe hat for the purposes of this session. Welcome everybody. I don't think I'm going to need to say very much more, except that the questions, as before, can be submitted on Slido. So please do that. We have 4 excellent speakers today: Danny Kruger, Rosie Campbell, Rachel Wolfe, and James Kanagusoriam, who I think are going to speak in that order. Since we have 4 great speakers and not a huge amount of time for all of them and questions, let's get straight into it with Danny Kruger, who has been MP for Devizes since December 2019. And before that, as I recall, worked for David Cameron. Danny, I think, is also sort of quasi-representing Onward here today, one of our co-hosts or organisers for this conference. So, without further ado, Danny.
Thanks, Jonathan. Very happy to be here, and I thought I'd just try and frame what I see as the political challenge the new government has, and I mean it'll be pretty familiar to all of you, but I hope this framing is useful. The immediate challenge is one that's I call executive. It's basically about being able to cope with the challenges of government immediately, hitting the ground running, as Liz Truss said. Well, she said hitting the ground, but hitting the ground running from day one. And I mean, I'm fairly impressed by what we've seen this week so far, but she has, and ministers have, this enormous challenge that all governments will of multiple extreme critical demands on them, and how they respond to that, and how the machinery of government, and particularly number 10, works is going to be the first test. And just managing the cost of living crisis in the immediate term, in the short term, is, as I say, largely an executive challenge, because we can think about the long-term impacts, particularly of the package that's been announced today. But the first question is, will it work in its most immediate exam question of satisfying the crisis that is before us? Will they be good at that? And I am hopeful. The second, broader and equally familiar challenge is the economic one. How are we going to get out of the hole that COVID and Ukraine has thrust us into? And what we're seeing is a bet on growth, a bet on a stimulus to economic activity. And we've just had a very fascinating session, Jonathan, you were in before this, which went over that. I think a critical question for me that the government has a circle they have to square, and it was raised briefly in the previous session, is about trade versus protection, bluntly. And I represent a rural seat. Obviously, farming doesn't make up the bulk of GDP, even in my seat, let alone in the country as a whole. Nevertheless, if we're talking about politics, it matters enormously. And how to defend and promote British agriculture and our food processing industries and domestic food production, while also being part of a global food economy, is going to be a great challenge. But I've heard encouraging indications on that, and secondly, on related point is the race for energy self-sufficiency and ultimately energy export, which the Prime Minister emphasised today in her statement to be an energy exporter by 2040. It's a significant and very exciting ambition. So beyond the economic challenge, the long-term resilience of our country, I think, depends on the reform of the state. And this, to me, was the great disappointment of the Boris Johnson years because of COVID coming along. They came into government Boris and the team with the commitment to get Brexit done and to reform Whitehall, and the challenge of making the systems of the British government work well. And as constituency MPs, we're extremely familiar with the dysfunctions of government, of its apparatus. Trying to get a passport, trying to get a visa for a refugee, trying to get a driving license. There's essential dysfunctions in the way our government works, which need addressing. And I think if we can't get to grips with those in the coming years, we'll have to answer to the voters for it. And then lastly is the most nebulous, but perhaps most significant, which is the challenge over culture, over who we are, about how our social relations are organised around the narrative of our nation. And this is why this question of the cross-channel migration is so significant, how much that has to be addressed and resolved. And to my mind, and I think the government feels this very strongly, that unless we can properly tackle the question of illegal migration into this country across the channel, then we are going to undermine the basis of our genuinely generous attitude towards refugees more generally, the obvious need to expand our refugee policy, given the enormous people movements that are going on around the world, and to continue to accommodate growing numbers of skilled migrants, as we heard in the previous session, has increased since Brexit, which is a welcome thing. So there is an enormous challenge over illegal and legal migration that needs to be resolved, as well as all these other cultural questions around trans and questions of conversion therapy and these other very difficult questions which might not feel central, but I think are of significant importance, and particularly to Conservative voters and our MPs. So there are these great cultural questions, and I will end with my ambition and hope that the way to resolve many of these issues, the economic challenge, the challenge of the British state, and these cultural questions, is to strengthen the resilience of our communities themselves, to create stronger families and stronger neighbourhoods that enable people to look out for themselves, support their families, and be good neighbours. And that is the path to ultimately to reducing the acute demands on the public services that we have at the moment, ultimately unsustainable demands, by strengthening the quality of family and local life, and to build the resilience of our communities, enabling social reinvestment, investment in the preventative services, social infrastructure, and the institutions of communities, rather than constantly chasing the ever-spiralling costs of acute late intervention, which is the reality of public spending at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Danny. I'll go straight on to my colleague from King's, who indeed is co-located with us in the Virginia Woolf building, aptly named for Rosie, who is the director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's, and is a political scientist, professor of politics, and has done a considerable amount of research on the on parliamentary candidates and parliamentary processes. But without further ado, over to Rosie.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I'm not going to talk about all the challenges that the Prime Minister faces, because, as we know, there are many, and I'm not expert on all of them. So I'm going to focus on the things I know about. But one of the things that I think I can reflect on as not being a politician is I don't just have to look at one electoral cycle, but can look forward into multiple electoral cycles. And much as I agree with much of what Danny said, I think where we depart is on the issue of culture and culture wars. And I feel that there has been a deliberate stoking up of a kind of core vote strategy and creating a culture war that didn't really exist and most people don't really care about. And I think it's really very dangerous, because I think this is a moment where what we need is a much more centrist direction. And there are some really good, I think, moral reasons for that, but actually from a party political point of view, there are some really good strategic reasons for that. And I'm very hopeful that the new Prime Minister perhaps has one story for the electors that she's just faced, the members of the Conservative Party, and might be developing a broader narrative for the broad coalition that she will need to bring together, not just to win the next election, but if the Conservative Party want to win elections in the future. because I think there's a very good chance if there isn't that longer-term centrist anti-polarisation strategy, we will move to a situation where we end up with continuous coalition governments and the Conservative Party never has a majority ever again. So I think if I'm not standing from party political position here, but if I were a strategist for the Conservative Party thinking into longer term, this is something I would think about very seriously. And one of the reasons that I think this is that it seems to be widely underreported that at the last election we know that younger people, and that definition of younger people is very broadly defined, and I slip in quite easily, under 50. We're more likely to vote Labour than Conservative, overtaken social class by a long way as a predictor of support. But hidden within that is the fact that in 2017 and 2019, for the first time in the post-war period, the Labour Party had an advantage amongst women voters and the Conservative Party had a disadvantage. So the Conservative Party, which has had through that period the support of women voters, lost it. And I don't know why we don't talk about it. I don't know why it's not part of the narrative. I think it doesn't fit with the levelling up agenda and the stereotypical portrayal of the kind of white van man. But actually, if you look at the nature of poverty in this country, it is disproportionately female. If you look at who has the insecure, low-paid jobs, those people who are now really worrying about paying their fuel bills, they are disproportionately women. And so I think this idea that I love the fact that the new Prime Minister calls herself a Destiny's Child feminist, and that she thinks it's all about financial independence, and that is wonderful. But there is an infrastructure that financial independence needs to be built upon. And we can argue about what the minimum basis for that infrastructure is. But if, for example, you look at the escalating cost of childcare in this country and the potential for women to exit the labour force, we can see that investment in childcare as core infrastructure is absolutely key. And if we're moving towards low taxes and minimal state, one of the first things that goes is childcare. So that's a serious concern of mine, and one that I think if the new Prime Minister wants to win the next election, she needs to think hard about. But seriously, the Conservative Party needs to think about how are they going to engage with younger voters, with women who are struggling to buy houses, struggling to pay their bills. And I've heard quite a few politicians talking about the current crisis as being a one-off, this is once in a century. I think if we think about this seriously, that is unlikely. The war in Ukraine is not unrelated to climate change and the pressure we have on natural resources. I don't think we can think these crises are just going to stop next year or the year after and we can go back to business as usual. We need serious investment in infrastructure. And I know the announcements today talked about the fact there will be investment in renewable energy and other kinds of more sustainable energy. But that absolutely has to be at the heart of this if we can have a consensus-building coalition that will bring together voters from the Red Wall, traditional professional women voters who would traditionally have voted Conservative, and make a real change. So my view is that there needs to be a movement to the centre, not a movement away from the centre. And I think without that, it's a real danger that we'll end up with a breakup of the union. As I've said already, the end of first-past-the-post electoral system, the end of majoritarian governments. So if I were a Conservative Party Prime Minister right now, I would be thinking very hard about these issues.
Thanks, Rosie. Thanks for reminding me that as a 50-plus male, that I'm almost certainly a Conservative, statistically, at any rate. So next up, we have Rachel Wolfe, who is a partner at Public First, and also a previous special advisor at Number 10 and co-author of the 2019 Manifesto, which in constitutional terms, although Rosie knows much more about this, still stands, right? I mean, changing Prime Minister, means
it's the party.
It's a party, so, and the manifesto on which they were elected, so notionally is still what we voted for in 2019, even if we're now going to get something that, at least in some respects, might be quite different. So, Rachel.
Thank you. It feels quite strange to be talking about this, about what happens now when we're all waiting for potentially very momentous news, and our thoughts are not quite here. And that news is not only momentous emotionally, but could have profound political consequences, at least in the very short term, in terms of how the Prime Minister responds and seems to the country. So I thought rather than talking about the challenges now, we should talk about what we think might still be true over the next few years. And the first key question I have to consider is, what are the political challenges the Prime Minister faces? And the truth is that we have absolutely no idea. When I was involved in the 2019 Manifesto, we did not predict COVID. We did not predict a monumental energy crisis. We assumed we would sweep in with our 80-seat majority and rewire the state and deliver for the British people. I think what the Prime Minister has shown is she knows at least the basic minimum of what she has to do to survive. So the thing we heard again and again in focus groups over the summer, and I'm sure James will talk about this as well, is why the hell are leadership contenders talking about things that matter so little to me when I have no idea if I can heat my home or eat this summer? What are they doing? And she's recognised that, and she has come through with a package which is, I think, large enough and universal enough to survive. But she will get hit with further crises, and her ability to respond to those crises will determine how the public sees her. I think the second thing that we know, I'll be interested if James agrees with me on this, is the electorate has realigned. And what strikes me when talking to the people who voted Conservative for the first time in 2019 is mentally they feel now like permanent swing voters. They feel volatile. They could go Labour, they could go Conservative, they could go Faragist. But they will remain a key battleground. What we tried to do in 2019, which is impossible to do serially, is appeal to those people while maintaining the broad Conservative coalition of traditional fiscal Conservatives and Southern Conservatives together. I think it is going to be impossible for the Prime Minister to win without appealing to those new voters. I think the third thing we know is that no government can get re-elected if the basic functions of the state don't seem to be operating. So if the NHS is completely dysfunctional, if crime feels like it is going up significantly in people's areas, which right now we hear a lot of, if the basic things that you expect the state to deliver are clearly not being delivered, then she doesn't have a hope. So to echo some of what Danny said, it seems to me that the basic challenge she has is, while dealing with these external crises, to get the government to deliver something after a few years where it has delivered relatively little, sometimes for good reasons, COVID being one, and sometimes for bad reasons, which is that I think partly through personality and partly because of the environment he found himself in, the previous Prime Minister didn't grip the country and didn't deliver. And that's going to require prioritisation, a very high focus on delivery, and a willingness to balance delivering on those core functions of the state with what she's also trying to do, which is bring in an entirely new ideology in how she thinks about tax and growth. So that's not a small list. And I think that will be true for prime ministers for many decades to come. We seem to me to be in a more fragile world externally and a more volatile political world internally. And her ability to navigate that while still being able to make positive progress, I think, is going to be central to her success.
Thank you. Rachel, you wrote a very interesting article yesterday or the day before, which many people here probably read, about the number 10 structure. As I took it, the TLDR was, choose 5 areas or whatever and focus on them and let everybody else get on with the job. What would those areas be for you?
For me?
Yeah.
Energy security. I'm personally also very in favour of net zero, and I think there's a big political advantage to it, but I'll wrap that into energy. The NHS, dealing with the backlog, dealing with basic service provision. I think for a certain cadre of voters, the sense that immigration is out of control is starting to become a real problem. I think there are lots of ways you can deal with that, but you do need to seem to be dealing with it. I'm thinking about this. No one's actually asked me this question before. And I do think showing a path on the economy is going to be critical. My fifth one is actually not a political one. It's a policy one. And I'm personally associated. We are 95% of the way towards delivering one of the most consequential changes in the skills system that we've seen in decades that might actually deliver a skills system that could long-term improve economic conditions. And it would be a real shame if we dropped it in the last 5%. So that'd be my fifth.
Thanks. Okay, and final speaker is James Kanagasoriam, who is a partner at who's a data scientist, essentially. Is that fair? He's a partner at Harborough, but he's also a shared resource at the moment, I guess, between Onward, of which you're a board member, and the UK and a Changing Europe, where you've just joined us, or just about to join us. I'm not quite sure which, as a researcher. James's expertise is polling, popular public opinion, and data science. And over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. You might have missed me in the office, but get a good chance to talk now. I'm going to give my views about what I think the public think, rather than any personal view. But I have three things to say broadly. From a public opinion perspective, I think there are three main challenges and three main things that people want delivered. And I would summarize them as bills, delivery, and the re-establishment of trust. The degree to which the cost of living crisis and the energy bill crisis has swamped everything else in terms of public opinion can't be overstated. I've rarely seen an issue dominate it quite like this. I mean, COVID would probably be the last time, but we do live in an era of perma-crisis. But fundamentally, how the government deals with the energy crisis is the predominant thing that will determine whether the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party's vote share stabilises and increases. And you can see clearly we won't know the effects of the package that was just announced. Delivery, I want to talk about a little bit because I think it's been mentioned by all three other panellists today, which is delivery over the main functions of government, which is NHS backlogs. Can you get a passport? Can you come through an airport? There is a feeling when you do focus groups and when you look at polling that people feel that the basic things that they could take for granted are no longer there. And that's very, very challenging. And I think fundamentally the government's ability to deliver the basics is going to be critical. The final thing, trust, just a little bit on that. The public opinion data very clearly shows that there was quite a large rupture of trust over Partygate, over a large number of events that occurred that ended with the change of Prime Minister. And fundamentally, the next leader, and now we know who that is, Liz Truss, will have to re-establish trust in government and in herself and in what the Conservative Party are doing. So I would see that as the three core pillars from the perspective of public opinion. Just a little bit of a note on culture wars here. I'm obviously a fellow board member of Danny and I know him. It's a very valid personal view that tackling the culture wars, either from the perspective of the right or the left, is a key task for government. There is nothing in the public opinion data that suggests that. It is a very low salience issue. It is absolutely not what voters want. It was rarely what voters wanted before. And I understand, though, that's, political beliefs aren't just what's popular or what's salient. But I certainly wouldn't see that as a key pillar for stabilising the centre-right as a force at all. And just as a final gambit, Rosie, talking a little bit about the Conservative Party and the advice there. I remember growing up and reading lots of books about the end of conservatism. And Lord Ashcroft published Smell the Coffee in 2005, and I remember reading it. And then we've just had 6 elections in a row where they increased their vote share, and is one of the only centre-right parties in the world to do that, and has governed the UK for, I think, 74% of its existence, well, at least in the last century. So I think the death and the decline, but also the dominance of parties, tends to be overstated. Just in general, people tend to be slightly behind the cycle. And indeed, if the Conservative Party does very badly, then there's actually a non-linear relationship to proportional representation. If Labour get a majority, then it's probably less likely. And actually, there's is somewhere in the middle, where they get a minority government where it is more likely. So even then, I think jury's massively out. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Okay, so I'm going to start by abusing my position as chair, partly, but as you know, since I have strayed a bit into politics or political analysis recently on the topic of immigration, I would actually like to, and two of you at least did mention it, I would slightly like to unpick this, and in particular, I mean, what Danny said, I think, but I'd like him to expand, is that sort of essentially that the government needs to get control over cross-channel, the cross-channel small boats issue in order to provide the basis for its current policies on legal skilled migration. I'm not sure what Rachel mentioned immigration in general terms, but and that people were beginning to have more concerns about whether that relates to the cross-channel issue, one of control, or more broader issues around immigration. I wrote recently that something which had really surprised almost everybody was how the big swing in popular opinion towards migration over the past 10 years, but particularly since the referendum, less salient in general and more popular, and the fact that that Brexit has not as yet resulted in a decrease in migration, but rather a reorientation from EU to non-EU migration, which at the moment seems to be brought to command broad popular acceptance. But I'd welcome everybody's views on that, whether I've got anything, whether I'm mischaracterizing or got anything wrong. Neil O'Brien, who was going to be in Danny's place on the panel, disagrees with me on this, and we had a debate in the columns of Conservative Home. So I'm genuinely interested in what you all think.
Well, yeah. I mean, you've got characterised my position correctly. You know, we need to be a generous, outward-looking nation. We are a very cosmopolitan country as it is, and that is our future. And to maintain that and extend it, including, as I mentioned, in the field of refugees. And I had a lot to do with the Ukrainian refugee program that the government introduced. Massive dysfunction at the Home Office in terms of the visa issuing, but the policy itself of welcoming as many refugees as the country itself wants to offer homes to, I think reflects well on the government and on the country in terms of the take-up. It was absolutely tremendous. And I think that community sponsorship model is the right approach for refugee resettlement overall, and I think I'd like to see it expanded to many other for many other groups of refugees. And likewise, on skilled migration, it is a very good thing that this country is so receptive and such a popular destination for people with skills. Not that we want to denude every other country of its skilled workers. There is a tension there. But these are good things. The challenge of the illegal cross-channel migration is very, very real because it reflects the fact that we are not in control of our borders and that it is possible to gain entry to this country simply by having the wherewithal to arrive here. And that offends the notion of fairness and sovereignty very deeply. And I mean, the point about culture wars that James raises, of course, he's right. And of course, what is the culture war? What exactly are we talking about? I think that battle is salient, that particular aspect of it, which is around migration and sovereignty and control of our borders, is very, very real for people in places very, very far from Dover, because it goes to the heart of what it is to be a nation, which, if it means anything, is that you have to be invited, you have to have a right to live here, you can't just turn up or break in. So I think that matters enormously. But yes, in principle, we need to be very in favour of being a high migration country, certainly one that's very, very generous to refugees, but we do need to have sovereignty of our borders.
Let's take Rachel next.
Sure. I mean, I think there are two big sort of policy elements that come into play here. The first is control, and I think the problem with small boats, certainly from what I pick up when talking to the public, is it fatally undermines the sense that the government is in control of anything, can manage anything. if they can't even do this, and that is a big problem. I should say, this is not a top issue for the public in general, but it is quite a big issue for a subset that matters quite a lot electorally. The other thing that comes up a lot kind of more generally, and it's about how we've chosen to manage the state in part, is this concept of contribution. So fairness and contribution and reward are kind of values that you get a lot when you talk to people, and particularly people who are likely to vote Conservative. And it's this sense that you put in before you get out, that we have rules in place that ensure fairness in effort and reward terms, because there are different kind of definitions of fairness. So, for example, one of the things that tends to be very popular, I think we first met when we talked about it, whether you think it's dealer manageable or not, is a contributory welfare system. People quite like the idea of going back to a kind of Beveridge-style contributory welfare system where there's a card, because it plays into this view. So I think immigration is sort of problematic in those terms. But to pick up what James is saying, the basic thing that this government has to do, and immigration is unquestionably one of the ways in which they have to do it, is demonstrate that they are competent, in control, and have a grip.
Very clear. James, anything to add to that? Or?
Yeah, I don't know if it's semantics, but I would definitely see the issue of small boats as a competency and delivery question, not a cultural question.
Yeah,
and I think it's good to be quite precise. What is the cultural, Danny? It's a fair enough challenge. But I think, look, I think we're moving out of a phase where culture has been the predominant force, I think, behind the realignment. So the voters that have left the right and the voters that have joined the right very heavily correlated to people that have very strong cultural views and where their economic views might be hazier. I'm not certain that that's where we're heading to in terms of the next election. I think economic issues are salient again. I think the argument over the size of the state, the argument the size of the deficit, the debt, how we spend our money, who is it spent on. I think these issues are coming back, and I think that's a function of the fact that we're facing an economic crisis. A very similar thing happened in the great financial crash, and then the conservatism of David Cameron that was formed from that, which was a heavily kind of fiscal type conservatism. Now, it's not necessarily the Conservative Party is going to go back to that. It's more that the economics of the situation are the salient thing. And one thing I would note about the contributory principle that Rachel mentioned, which we've not talked about, but it was mentioned briefly, which is younger people. Now, Onward have released a poll, which I didn't do, but it was very, very good, last week about younger people no longer believing in democracy. So something like 50% of people believing that if there was a strong leader but no parliamentary elections, that would be okay. That's a very challenging statistic. And actually, if we're thinking about contributory principles, if you're young, you've given up your freedoms for COVID, you've done a lot, you pay a marginal rate of above 50% if you've gone to university, your freedoms have been curtailed, and you've entered a job market that is less than good. The contributory principle needs to work all the way up both the income scale and the age curve. And I think finding a way to approach that, there may not be a political dividend to that. It's clear that the age is a defining barrier between centre-left and centre-right, but just for holding the political culture and the political economy together, that's going to be quite important.
Well, I mean, I must say it's reassuring for me as somebody who's both an economist and who sort of grew up in a time when, when political debates were primarily about the economy, both about economic growth, regulation, but also about distributional issues and the welfare system, that we might be going back to that and having a little less cultural realignment, which economists like me, of course, are much less comfortable with talking about. But Rosie, did you want to respond either on the immigration point, but also to James?
I might just respond to James. Immigration is not my research area. I wasn't intending to declare the death of the Conservative Party. I was trying to sort of advise against complacency. And I think if you look back to the Labour Party and what happened to the Labour Party in Scotland or in the Red Wall, I don't think it's unimaginable that similar things could happen to the Conservative Party in the Blue Wall. And I think taking that seriously is important. And actually, having tried to say that I've got a more moderate position than it might have sounded, I'm now going to say something really radical and think, I genuinely am concerned about threats to democracy, and that's part of my call to not polarise for short-term electoral gain, because polarisation is a huge part of how anti-democratic movements get themselves supported, how they activate their base, and actually pushing the culture war. We don't want to follow the US. And so I think that actually what we need to do is have a much more moderate, considerate politics rather than to be at the extremes, or democracy is under threat.
Yeah, I think let's carry on with this. It's an interesting topic. I mean, I must say I slightly read that poll. I thought that Onward slightly overhyped that, in the sense that 85% of the respondents also said they supported democracy, right? It wasn't 50% say we'd prefer a dictatorship to democracy. Do others share Rosie's concerns about the threats to democracy? I must say, having just returned from the US, I have to say, that we do not feel it. Being in the US feels very different, and not really in a good way, frankly. There's a lot of problems in this country, but we're not there.
I think we often fall into this very lazy assumption on a lot of issues that we're the US, and Britain really is not the US. Public opinion is not the US. And again, I mean, this culture war, this kind of gets all lumped together. So just to repeat something James said, no one is going to vote on trans. It's not going to happen. They don't care. And actually, people have rather similar views on it. There's a huge amount that they hold in common. People are deeply patriotic, and they will react negatively to a leader or a party that seems to dislike the country or the people within it. And they will react negatively to actions that they think undermine this. Immigration is not a cultural issue. It's not a culture war issue in that sense. So I think we often lump these together because they're things that are associated with the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, but they're wholly different in the public's mind, which is why we're not like America in part. So I think we have to be slightly careful about what we're thinking about. It certainly, in my view, would be the case that if the Conservative Party strategy was to launch an all-out culture war based on gender identity, it would be one of the most self-defeating electoral strategies in history. And given Conservative Party is quite good at winning elections, I'd be very surprised if they did.
Danny, did you want to?
Yeah, well, no, absolutely agree with that. But the challenge that Rosie makes, which is to have a more centrist politics. I mean, obviously we want to avoid a politics that stokes division deliberately. And the paradox of our country, of our political system, which has been essentially binary, we have two main parties, left and right, slug it out. For all that, we've actually had a fairly united political culture for decades, unlike in Europe, where they have a more multifarious political system. But actually, I think precisely because there is a more centrist culture there, you actually end up with much more divisive politics, and you get far more vicious and far more extreme alternatives being presented as mainstream politics in, for instance, France or Italy or even Germany at times, than you do in the UK. So it's actually because I think our system responds to, and responds quicker and earlier to, growing, and we can call them cultural or political, economic, national feelings, that we're able to maintain a civil political discourse. And so, and I don't think it's. I think what the party should do is be true to themselves and chase votes. And if they both do that, because ultimately the voters are the same people, we'll end up with the civil, ultimately consensual discourse with a sort of dialectic conflict all the way through. Then they should take on some kind of responsibility to get together in the back office, in the back rooms of Westminster, and say, let's not stir up popular opinion. Let's all agree with each other. I think that is ultimately far more destructive and threatening to democracy than having a ding dong out there about some fairly key fundamental points of difference.
Just a note on polarisation. I'm not sure that polarisation is necessarily driven by individuals or political characters. I mean, I always reference kind of Robert Putnam's work, Bowling Alone, which I know is from America, but fundamentally, his idea of the big sort being driven by the change in work occupations, the expansion of higher education, the entering of women into the... No.
It's true.
there are huge structural geodemographic forces at play here, and that big sort has occurred across Western developed societies everywhere. And so I think kind of we've taken a very UK view here, but actually all the trends that you see, all the realignments that have occurred across the right, left, I'm talking to two political science professors here, fundamentally is very similar. Like, if the Canadian federal election was very interesting last year, where there was an exact realignment very similar to the 2019 election here, but the characters were totally different. Justin Trudeau, much further to the centre versus the radical left, and the Erin O'Toole, the old Canadian leader, was also much further to the centre, but the voters realigned anyway. And I think that's kind of happening everywhere.
I don't think that I'm suggesting people get in a back room and all agree. And I actually think that the Conservative Party members on the panel are saying the Conservative Party will be very strategic and listen to what will secure votes. And I think what I was trying to highlight is that I think a focus on the culture wars won't do that. And that seems to be agreement across the panel. So I'm really pleased to hear it.
Yeah. So let me move on to questions where, so I have, there are a number of questions about, and it's quite interesting. So no one has mentioned Brexit yet.
We got it done.
Well, maybe that answers the question, but one popular question says, is the abandonment of the Brexit Opportunities Ministry a final acceptance and no such opportunities will be forthcoming? But I mean, I thought your priorities, Rachel, really didn't cover Brexit at all. Nobody else has mentioned it. Does that mean? So two questions really. One from a sort of from an economic point of view, does that mean that actually, that there, not that there are no Brexit opportunities, but that essentially that's not going to be a central plank of the new government, is not going to be pursuing opportunities from Brexit? There are other things that are more important and then politically, there obviously still are some people on the right who think that there is mileage to be gained by saying that Labour or the Liberal Democrats would reverse Brexit or betray Brexit in some way. Is there, has that argument essentially run out of steam, either because time has passed, or because because Brexit has become actually rather less popular, or because there are just much more important things like the energy crisis to deal with? So sort of views on where we go from here on Brexit, both politically and economically. We'll start with Danny.
Okay, so well, we had a very good discussion in the last session about the economics of Brexit and obviously the disruption it's meant for trade with Europe, and the benefits will be over the long term. So the jury remains out, obviously, and if there's an advantage to it, it's one that we can't judge yet. I think there is some value in the we've discussed migration. I think the key reason for voting for Brexit, and I voted for it, was about giving flexibility to this country in threats and challenges that we cannot yet anticipate, and the need to have a more nimble and agile posture on a whole range of topics. Doesn't mean that we can't and shouldn't have very close, even institutional relationships with our neighbours and partners on these questions of international concern, including migration, by the way. We can't deal with cross-channel border migrants without relationships with the EU. So I think the immediate job of achieving sovereignty was done. The question of future trade is ongoing. Maximising the opportunities of a more highly skilled global migration system rather than a low-skilled European one is being enacted. The trade opportunities remain. However, as I think I mentioned, from my perspective, I'm less excited about those than some of my colleagues. I think the main mission should be about boosting our domestic resilience. And then on industrial strategy, the opportunities to invest and to if necessary, subsidise industries in a way that we couldn't do in the EU, I think are opportunities that will be maximised. But it's not going to be part of the narrative, nor should it be, because that job was done. So I don't see the particular politics. There might be a big bit of politics around about the impacts of the European Court and the European Convention, but as we know, that's nothing to do with the EU. That might be the next battle, but I don't think Brexit itself is particularly politically salient anymore.
Rosie.
I don't feel very well able to answer the question because I think in 2019 it was a huge factor shaping younger people and women's vote for the Labour Party versus Conservative Party, but I don't think that's so salient anymore.
Rachel?
You go first?
You go first.
So, I mean, there is a reason why the phrase was "get Brexit done" in 2019, in that it was appealing to a large number of people who just wanted to stop talking about it, almost regardless of how they voted. And I think that instinct remains, although I could imagine that for a certain swathe of voters, if they were convinced that Labour and Lib Dem would form a coalition to try and reverse the referendum result for democratic as much as any other reasons might play. But I think one of the really interesting things about Truss's premiership is that there was a large cadre of people who campaigned for Brexit, very different from the people who voted for it, who saw Brexit as a way to get to this highly deregulated state. They talked about Singapore on Thames. They were very keen on things like deregulation, on workers, supply side reforms. And it seems to me that she channels that spirit and will try and implement that spirit far more than Boris Johnson did, who I think was actually much closer to trying to deliver what the electorate mostly voted Brexit for, which was control, mostly over immigration, and money. So I think the next couple of years are going to be really interesting. And actually, the removal of the Brexit Opportunities Unit, I think, is more because she is going to try and do all the things that they've hoped to do, some of which are quite politically hard, and not particularly supported by some of the people who voted Brexit in the first place.
Yes, that indeed does. Somebody asked a question just on that, specifically on that, in particular with relation to employment law, was whether the Truss government would adopt a much more aggressive approach than the previous one did, and what the political implications of that are likely to be. And you're in sort of implying that that's not what people voted for.
I mean, she has shown herself willing to jettison things fast, and I would suggest that some things have been floated, like saying that they're not going to guarantee people's minimum holidays, and one of those things she's probably going to jettison quite fast. But there are other deregulatory reforms which are not politically possible, but are feasible. Sorry, politically popular, but feasible.
I think from a public opinion perspective, the reason we're not hearing much about Brexit is not a salient issue for the public, but also who stands to benefit from talking about it. I mean, the Liberals ran a very strong 2019 campaign on reversing it and disappointed for the fourth exit poll in a row, targeting 100 seats and got 12. The Labour Party has to build a coalition from Hampstead to Hull with the majority leave seats. And for the Conservatives, they got elected to finish it. So why is it not a salient issue? Well, no one stands to benefit from raising it as a particular issue. I mean, and also fundamentally, the electorate has moved on. Now, that doesn't mean that the consequences won't be felt and that there'll be political economy consequences from that, but it seems to me that everyone benefits from it not being a salient issue.
So we covered workers' rights. What about, someone asked about civil service and government reform. So the only pledge I think we have outstanding on that, I mean, is to cut the number of civil servants quite substantially, which in practice means, and the sort of cuts that were penciled in would inevitably mean some reduction in frontline services as well as policy. How consistent is that with this sort of focus on delivery, and is that likely to be pursued, or is that something that they might have to think again about?
Well, I mean that is a sort of totemic commitment that Liz and her campaign team have been attached to, Jacob particularly, and I think there is a sense that in a time of extreme fiscal pressure with a desire to stimulate the private sector, that slimming down government is both economically and politically sensible. And I think there is real value in pursuing the Whitehall reform agenda, which is a perennial, eternal challenge. Whitehall is always modernising, and we always think it's modernising too slowly. But since at least, in fact, since Tony Blair, most obviously, but particularly with Cameron and Francis Maude, there's been a focus on improving the efficiency of government, and that includes ultimately reducing headcount and footprint, which has swelled gigantically in recent years. And someone mentions Brexit, partly because we've reclaimed powers from Brexit, but the swelling of the civil service since 2016 was not what Brexit voters wanted. And the challenge now is to improve the state. And I don't agree that it requires cuts to frontline services. It might reduce the headcount potentially, but the improvement, partly through digital, improving systems, but also through what I regard as the great challenge of public service reform, which is to empower civil society and have a much more preventative state, reduces the need for those acute late intervention services, which are so expensive. And the example I always give at a local level is of Wigan, where in reaction to austerity in the early 2010s, the local authority in Wigan decided that they were going to maintain frontline public services, but cut their own back office substantially. And they were going to square this circle by empowering communities and doing what they call the Wigan deal, a deal with the citizens of the place to take more responsibility on a whole bunch of stuff, from recycling to public health, that enabled them to balance their budget, including on social care, which is the great cost, while taking 30% out of their costs. I think this sort of reform is possible nationally and locally, and we should be ambitious to reduce the spending that government itself claims, while not reducing the support that is actually given to people through, whether it's benefits or through the receipt of services like healthcare. I do think reduction in government spend on itself is a worthy priority.
Anyone else on this?
I'd like to say something briefly. I'm really pleased to see that when Liz Truss was Women Equalities Minister, she mentioned how one of the lessons from COVID about working from home can be a benefit for parents, and particularly women statistically. And of course, one of the things that we found out as a result of the huge switch to hybrid and remote working is that for certain kinds of work, we're more productive and we have quiet space, and also that we can make very efficient use of office space. So really, and of course, there can be massive geographical relocation if you make more use of remote and hybrid workers. So I do hope that this new government won't be going around sticking any little sticky notes on anyone's desks, and instead of behaving in a ridiculously symbolic way, will make some real efficiency savings.
I'm happy to come in briefly. Yeah. I'm going to channel Rosie here. I think we risk a slightly absurdly polarised argument on this stuff. It is possible to simultaneously believe that the biggest challenge for this government is having politicians and ministers who know what they are doing and know what they wish to do, and that the civil service is not optimised. I think it's not, and most senior civil servants and good civil servants that I speak to would privately agree with that. But you can't do that by, from the top down, blanket reducing headcount. It does require you to think about what you want the state to achieve and how. It seems to me that a Truss premiership could, for example, completely rethink the way in which we manage support for childcare or families, and make it vastly simpler and vastly more through the individual or the family or the community. There are ways in which you can develop policy so that it requires less central intervention, but it's not simple, and it is hard to do when you have 2 years to go, are dealing with constant crises, and have limited political capital.
Anyone else? Okay, I'm sorry.
The audience get to ask questions, just the people in the room.
They're supposed to ask online.
I see.
Yes, everyone's supposed to ask online. This is supposed to level the playing field. But there was one question specifically for you, actually, Rachel, which was to expand on your point about skills being 95% done, because I think that was, for those who are not skills nerds, that wasn't entirely clear, and it is an important policy area.
So I'll echo some of what was said in the previous panel, which is one of the challenges we have in many parts of the country is human capital, it's skills. We have a system at the moment which makes it very, very hard for people to train flexibly, for them to train later in their life, and also to train in areas that are not kind of full degree level technical. And this is one of the areas where we fall behind a reasonable number of comparator countries. The policy that's been brought in is called the Lifelong Learning Entitlement, which very simply says, rather than just being able to spend your student loan on a degree, you can spend it on whatever the hell you like, whenever you like, within reason, and ideally supplements it. So it's a way of opening up the system and redirecting it towards lifetime learning. This is one of the classic policy areas where, you know, I think Tony Blair famously said he could invade a country in the middle of a speech on skills and FE and no journalist would notice. Because it doesn't tend to excite Westminster, but it is both an issue for the public, you know, apprenticeships and skills comes up again and again, and something that holds back the country, and we're almost done.
Thanks, that was very clear. I hope you're right, having been myself the veteran of more skill strategies than I care to think of. Housing. No one mentioned housing, and it is both clearly, we've got a couple of questions on it, but it's fairly obvious. Look, it's obviously a huge economic problem, but it's also obviously, at the same time, a huge political problem, and again, something that successive governments have wrestled with, and I think we can all agree, failed. Any chance of things being different this time?
Yeah, looking at me. I mean, you know, well, let's see what. There's a whole bunch of new ministers being appointed now, so I mean, I shouldn't speculate on what I think they're going to come up with. There's a very clear direction of travel, which is to both reform the supply side through planning policy to ensure that the right sort of houses can be built in the right sort of ways. We need an increase in supply. The critical challenge is not just the right sort of houses, but houses and developments that have proper community support and buy-in. I'm a great fan of the community land trust model for that purpose, and we're badgering the next housing minister, as I have the last however many, to adopt that approach. But I think we're going to probably see a fairly politically sensible approach, and as much as many, probably among Liz's supporters, particularly in the think tank world, will be hoping for a radical deregulation. And a sort of bonfire of planning rules, I suspect, given the political reality of where our seats are and what our MPs think in Wiltshire and elsewhere, there's going to be some pragmatism and you know, ultimately you know, there is not a housing shortage in the country. The problem is the houses in the wrong place. If we can genuinely deliver levelling up, boost the economies of the towns of the Midlands and the North, the housing is there. It needs a lot of improvement and change, but we can. The part of the answer to the housing problem is levelling up, not just about how to grow supply in the south.
Who'd like to come in next on that?
I mean, the long-term challenge for building houses, the political consequences of that are quite large. I mean, it's well noted that one of the key drivers behind voting Conservative is being a homeowner, and along with a couple of other kind of demographic markers, and obviously home ownership, particularly with a mortgage. Home ownership without a mortgage has actually increased dramatically, particularly amongst older people. And in fact, you know, we've talked a little bit about the Red Wall, but you know, the key driver behind that predominantly was people over 50 who own their own homes without a mortgage. And fundamentally, there's political credit to be had from that. But you know, fundamentally, the lack of house building is an inbuilt issue, and I'm sure that the new Prime Minister understands and knows that. And the feel of the think tanks that are around her that do know her well have been talking about the politics of housing and the theory of housing affecting everything. So, I mean, that's going to be key. But it is also important to note that housing as a political issue varies massively by region. So this is a London, predominantly, I know online it won't be a London audience, but this is, when it's a critical marker for people under 40, but actually in areas of the northeast, in South Wales and North Wales and bits of the Midlands, it doesn't even figure at all. And I think that's just worth noting the difference.
I think that comes back to my earlier point about, do you think 1 election or 2 elections or 3 elections away? Because the difficult trade-off that you've described is, I live in a green belt area. I know that there's a lot of any development, how sensible, there's a huge amount of resistance. But if you want to have conservative futures of the future, why has that age band gone up to 50? Well, this, you're absolutely right, James. It's a huge part of why. And if we don't suffer the little bit of pain now to build those houses, where will they be in the future?
I mean, I think the truth is I've yet to spot a political party that thinks 3 elections in the future seriously is willing to take pain today anywhere in the world. But, I think housing is a monumental issue, and it's embarrassing that one of the things a state can do is build houses, and we can't build any houses. It seems to me that the best hope of this is that actually we have a Prime Minister who does believe in house building. But also, that it seems to me at least that tax cuts alone, particularly when they're mostly reversing tax cuts that weren't in place a few years ago, are unlikely to turn us to a trajectory of high growth. And the best hope that she has for what she's putting all of her eggs, the basket she's putting all her eggs in, is to do supply side reform, and the most obvious one to do is planning reform. I'm personally always quite attracted to the idea that if you're going to do this, you just need to choose where your political pain is going to be and make it as geographically concentrated as you can. But I don't know if that is how she would approach it.
What would that mean in practice?
Choose the seats you're willing to lose.
And build houses
And build
there.
houses on them.
Okay. James, do you think that works?
I'll reserve judgment.
I've never, okay.
I mean, it's worth...
It's not been tested against reality.
No.
We've not mentioned the Liberal Democrats, right? It's the spectre of the Liberal Democrats that have created challenges around planning reform, right? So the predominant southeastern blue wall, Conservative MPs who have majorities under 10,000, the predominant challenges from Liberal Democrat activists and the challenge from MPs. And that was the case in Chesham and Amersham. That was the case across the whole piece. And the Conservative Party obviously should build houses, but the Liberal Democrat Party should also be liberal and be backing that type of planning reform, and it hasn't. So, this is a problem that's spread across all the parties. Right? There's been lack of house building since the war. So.
So no one has really mentioned the union. So I have a couple of questions about Scotland and the possibility of a referendum. I mean, I think it was fairly obvious that Boris Johnson was not exactly hugely popular in Scotland. So there is presumably some sort of opportunity for a reset. Is that likely? And it seems to me that this is one issue where, as Rosie said, there is really a huge premium on thinking not just one election ahead, but 2 or 3, in terms of where you might hope that Scotland is within the UK in 10 years' time. What strategy do will and should the government adopt towards Scotland in particular, but possibly Wales and Northern Ireland as well? I'll start with you, Ray.
Well, that's cruel, because although I've said it's a massive issue, I'm not entirely sure how to resolve it. I think I'm going to hand back to the politicians.
One of the great experts on union politics, and responsible for the Conservatives' resurgence in Scotland. So I'm going to pass the message.
Nothing of the sort. Look, I think the question of the union has vexed UK politics for a long time. I'm not sure the avenues out are particularly clear. At this time, there is an opportunity for a reset. That's definitely the case. Boris Johnson had uniquely bad ratings in Scotland. He was aware of that, and those bad ratings actually preceded his premiership, which is important to note. Clearly, look, the union question isn't the same in Scotland either, as it is in Wales or as it is in Northern Ireland. The issue with Mark Drakeford in Wales is he governs as a soft nationalist, and is a Labour figure who's uniquely popular to Labour Leave voters in those areas. And the premium that Welsh Labour have over the English Labour Party is explained by the predominance amongst people who are Welsh identifying and also people who voted Leave in Wales, and you can see that. So the Brexit Party vote of 2019 actually has disproportionately since then fallen to the Welsh Labour Party. The situation in Scotland is very, very different. We've seen 3 elections with huge volatility, the electorate changing each time, often by hundreds of thousands, with double-digit swings going the opposite way from one cycle to the next. So what happens next is not clear from me, but what I would say is that we are still facing a yes-no vote in Scotland of 50-50, despite all of the things that have occurred. And if you think about the current Prime Minister as being the nadir of unionist support in Scotland, then actually this could go anywhere.
James, do you think that the shift from cultural to economic again makes people more frightened of the union dissolving in Scotland? Because they feel more economically insecure and it's a big economic risk.
I think it's too early to say on that. I think the trajectory of where we're going on the union still can't be known. The impact of the new Prime Minister won't be clear. Worth noting, she did grow up in Scotland. She grew up, I think, in Paisley, went around and then moved to Leeds when she was older. I mean, that's clearly not the same as being Scottish, but again, things are very different. And I think the position also in England is one that's been volatile as well. But what I would say is we've heard a lot about the death of the union for now getting close to 8 years. And we're still facing public opinion polls that are 50-50. Now, clearly, there are long-term factors at play in terms of the age curve of support for the union. But I think it's far too complex, right? The best unionist result was in straight after the Brexit referendum, and then the worst was 2 years later, and then 2015, before the EU referendum, was the best SNP result. So when people say it's all about Brexit, that is literally the opposite of the patterns that are visible. And then I guess the situation in Northern Ireland as well needs further analysis. You could do a whole panel event on this, I'm not sure. One question is adequate for that. Clearly, Sinn Féin, both in the Republic and in Northern Ireland, are at historic highs, and you're seeing what is a fragmentation of the unionist vote rather than a decline. That's another misreading of the Assembly votes between the TUV, the UUP, and the DUP. And then you're seeing some alignment to Alliance, who are non-aligned. So I think it's all to play for, and obviously with the court case that's ongoing, that may trigger another discussion over the union, but I think it's far too early to suggest where things are going inexorably. Sorry, that was not a very satisfying answer.
Danny, any?
I mean, it's not a great deal to add. I mean, that was very, very clear from James, and I think it is all to play for. The politics, or the sort of political strategy, insofar as you can discern it from what Liz seems to be planning to do, is a sort of continuation and an increase in Boris's approach, which was, I mean, she put it quite bluntly about disregarding Nicola Sturgeon, but to as it were, despite devolution, or to stop devolving and forgetting, handing powers and money to Edinburgh and Cardiff and saying, you get on with it and it's your work, to have direct relationships with, particularly in Scotland, with local government and in Wales, and to be quite assertively unionist, and to badge up UK projects accordingly, slapping the union flag on things in the way the EU used to do, and just asserting the existence and the value of the union. I mean, I think Rachel's question is right. As with Brexit, there's a combination of emotional and sort of transactional considerations that people bring, in the same way that we all have multiple identities within our own citizenship in a union like this one. And I think that I can see, as the cost of living bites, as global security and regional security becomes more precarious, the more transactional nature of the offer that the union represents to people in Scotland in particular might begin to trump the more nationalist impulses. But both will be factors all along, and I think the character of the PM and, you know, God forbid, what happens with the monarchy will be significant in the emotional story that's being told about the Union too.
Okay, I think we are normally at the, we're basically at the end of our time. So I'm going to just ask each of you to give, brief closing remarks, if you'd like. Ideally with some sort of clear prediction about what we might expect over the next year or two that we can then come back and confront you with the next time that you're on one of these sort of things. Because that's the sort of thing that we economists are always being asked to do, so I don't see why you political types should be exempt.
Is there a measure you'd like us to predict against?
Well, I mean, I'm sure people would, if you feel, and especially since we have two of you who are actually interested in the public opinion, you can predict what the share of the Conservative Party will be at either votes or seats at the next election. I'll start with you, James.
Well,
you must have thought about this.
It's a bit like The Economist, who predicts 7 of the last 2 recessions.
Right.
I'm extremely sceptical of people who would forecast vote share in time. I mean, the point is you shouldn't trust anyone who does do that. Because that's dud advice. We've got 2 years of the cycle. If you think how much changed in 2 years, if I asked you in 2020 what's going to happen in politics, and you told me where we'd be by 2022, I mean...
No, I think that's fair. A fairer question is, I think, what do you think will be the top 2 issues of the next election?
I think broadly it'd just be delivery. Yeah. To be honest, the thing about Liz Truss and her new premiership is she's got 2 years to deliver on 12 years of hope.
Right.
And it will be about the ability to deliver on the things that have been promised, that won an 80-seat majority, as well as her own priorities and the recalibration of that. And if there is delivery, I expect there to be credit for that. And if there isn't delivery, I'd expect a discount.
Fair enough. Rachel?
Yeah, just follow on for that. I mean, the 2019 manifesto managed to be a first-term manifesto for a fourth-term government, and you can't repeat that again. And all second-term manifestos are, we started the job, trust us to finish it. And that's what she's going to have to run on. And I agree that will rely on delivery and competence in a world that is going to be endlessly unanticipated events.
I would say if the recent past is a predictor of the future, there's going to be some issue that we've not even thought of, which is going to be the major issue of the next election.
And finally, Danny.
Well, I mean, I think we can confidently say we're going to see a bold and unflashy government. That's Liz's style and the way she's going to run things. So I think we've got a sense of what the character of the government's going to be, but obviously we don't know what the issues will be. I think we'll win the next election if we can deliver both competence and fixing the state, as we've discussed, but fundamentally security. So whether that, and again, depends on the issues, but that might be around, I hope it's not around serious European defence, issues around the borders, issues around crime, which we haven't discussed, vital importance, and the security of your family and your neighbourhood and your own personal finances. And I think if she can demonstrate through her radical and unflashy approach that she understands the fundamental need that people have for security in their homes, their neighbourhoods and their nation, then we will have given people what they want, as well as being seen to be genuinely addressing, we haven't discussed enough, what levelling up really means, which is a rebalancing and the extreme spatial inequality of our country so that we can be one nation again. And I think that is her commitment, and I think she's on track.
Okay, so it's 4:45. I think we have drinks downstairs. Is that downstairs where the coffee was? So we have drinks downstairs. Ollie informs me there's an awful lot of alcohol that needs to be drunk, so you are all required to go down there and help him drink it. Thanks to the panelists, Rachel, Rosie, Danny and James, for a very stimulating discussion. I certainly learnt quite a bit from it, and I hope you did too. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the team from UK and Changing Europe, Onward and Resolution Foundation for organising, and that's it. Thank you very much.